to the first episode of the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast, PPPP, if you will, although I can't say that with a straight face, so we're probably just going to call it the Positive Perspectives Podcast. In this series, we will be kind of re-exploring the material that we've gone over in the past couple of years in our book club, which those recordings will be available separately. So, our goal then is to create a sort of narrative through philosophy. We're going to be discussing all sorts of topics, starting from ancient philosophy. This week, Heraclitus with Logos, among some other writers and philosophers. And then later on, we'll be working through ancient Athenian philosophy and moving forward from there. So
it's worth noting also that we're pairing this week Heraclitus with Descartes. And those of you who are super savvy on Positive Perspectives history will know that we didn't initially do that in our first book club, but that recording doesn't exist, so we can kind of take liberties, and what we decided to do was pair Heraclitus with Descartes for this discussion because we thought that it really helped us cover some important things.
Yeah, in retrospect, we have that capability to kind of redo our pairings a little bit, and of course, just make the topics more streamlined, like I said, make more of a narrative throughout. So, without further ado, I am Jacob. And this is my co-host, Brandon.
Yes, happy to be here. And I will go ahead and start with a question. Seems the best way to begin.
Very well.
My question is, what do you think the most tricky thing is about reconciling Heraclitus's and Descartes' different views of logos? Inherent in that is probably the need to define logos. And that's where we'll get into the weeds, because those of you who have studied logos at all might realize it's tough to define.
That was kind of what I was going to say, actually, is I'm not sure what Heraclitus meant exactly. He's so removed from us in time, and then furthermore, his writings are literally called fragments because we have fragments from, his lectures, his writings. So
very enigmatic.
We almost don't know how to translate his thoughts into our own.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
I would agree with that, and that's a tricky thing for any translation, but even more when all you have is fragments.
So that brings me, actually, one of the things I wanted to mention in our introduction was that neither of us are professionals in any way whatsoever. We started from ground zero. We had a baseline interest in meeting together and talking about these things. We knew we liked talking about philosophy.
True that.
But that's it. So please join us in this journey from ground zero. It's completely fine if you don't really know who Heraclitus or Descartes is, or are, excuse me. We didn't either.
Yeah, and to put it in perspective, we started reading about a year ago, or 2 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And we started with the ancient, as far ancient back as we could go, and then we would pair an ancient text with a somewhat more modern text. At the beginning, we picked like the date 1500 or something like that, to 1200 as our...
Kicked it back to 500 eventually,
yeah.
And then we abandoned that process after about a year anyway, so that'll be relevant for the next few weeks only.
We jumped around a little bit, and then we left a big gap in the middle where we didn't necessarily talk about all of the moderns, and we jumped into the postmodern era, and it gave us an interesting perspective thinking about how one group of thinkers seems to have a belief that humanity can think through things, and then the other group of humanity has less faith in human reason. And that's part of the reason why I think Jacob and I believed that Heraclitus and Descartes were such a good pairing.
Yeah, they are. Why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit more about what Heraclitus did view, what we do know about him, especially in terms of this idea of logos that he seemed to coin, if I'm not mistaken.
The way he described it was that logos was in everything, and he said, quote, "Instead of listening to me, listen to the logos," and that's more of a paraphrasing quote, but the whole point was you can't find any sort of structure to quantify being by just studying minutia. So at least that's the way I interpret it.
So it's like a great unifying theme?
A unifying theme to existence.
Interesting.
That's why I felt logos as such might be a narrative. And I was going to ask you what you thought a similarity was or a difference was between narratives and logos. And I can add more perspective on that if you want.
Yeah, that's kind of a confusing question because from my perspective, logos has something associated with structure. more than, I mean, narrative is a sort of structure, so I'll admit that. However, I don't necessarily view it as the same sort of thing unless you want to view logos on a real metaphysical level where it's like it almost has a conscious, ability, and then I could see it being more of a narrative generating force. But but that's going quite far.
Yeah, it might be better to just call it, in all honesty, that simple word structure. And that seems to be the most honest way, without overstepping, to interpret Heraclitus, because he doesn't go out of his way to delineate logos in a purely Christian, deified sense, but he verges on deification.
Okay.
I would say. He does not deify.
Well, what would it look like for him in his time period? When was that? 600, 700 BC?
Pretty early.
Pretty early. Oh, no. It was 475 BC, looks like. Anyways, what would it look like for him to make a deity or conceive of a deity like that in the context of Ephesus and the pantheon that existed there?
I think it looked like negation. He did a lot of negation of the deities that existed because he saw them as man postulating up something that seemed reasonable to him from minutia. All the things he sees. He sees a storm and it destroys his barn, and he says, "Oh, Zeus is angry with me."
Yeah, so they were like anthropomorphizing and just
quite possibly
doing some reasoning based on observation.
This is all that we can see, honestly, from Heraclitus. We can't necessarily just say that he wasn't a devout person.
Yeah, but you almost would say that he was a sort of critic of the existing religion.
Yeah, it seems that way because of logos.
Yeah,
because the structure seemed to defy all the ways people were living.
So then he would have viewed logos as something more fundamental than the existing deities.
Yes, even more fundamental than the spirituality that currently existed. And that's really where I think an interesting contrast happens with Descartes. And I know this is a big jump of over 1,000 years, but stick with us. I think Jacob can really lend some light on how Descartes viewed logos, and then we can really get an interesting greater question from the contrast between Descartes and Heraclitus.
Right. So I don't know that Descartes ever really acknowledged the Greco-Roman idea of logos precisely. He might have, but I don't know. But he does open a discourse on method, his very famous work in which, the quote, "I think, therefore I am," with good sense is among all things, good sense is, of all things among men, most equally distributed. So if we think about that in contrast with what Heraclitus was saying about logos, they have some things in common, or in comparison with Heraclitus and logos. This commonality is that they're endowed upon all men. And we have an additional commonality of linguistically, logos meaning something like logic or language or reasoning, those sorts of things, with good sense. Linguistically, we're in the same ballpark. And they're both endowed upon all men. And so one could argue, I don't know that I necessarily do, but one could argue that Descartes was talking about the exact same thing that Heraclitus was over 1,000 years before.
He says good sense.
Yes.
Did he mean by good sense the empirical view of sense, good ability to perceive with the five senses?
Not quite.
What did he mean by that?
He actually meant the ability to reason within oneself and to come to a conclusion that was suitable to oneself.
So logical process of thought.
Yeah, and this was, in fact, the basis for modern empiricism, modern sciences. I don't know his exact title, but he was the father of modern science.
Yeah.
He is.
That thought structure is just so revolutionary. When you think of things from the very first possible step, and you go step by step, proving thing after another, why do you think some people don't submit to Descartes' process? Why do some people resist whenever they get faced with the fact that process by process we come to a conclusion? Why do some people not trust that?
That's a really good question. But ultimately it comes down to us not being able to trust our own faculties. And Descartes sort of admitted to this. He would say that in observation, our five senses and anything that comes into the mind is subject to a distortion. However, what is within the mind is not subject to that. Whatever is within the mind, we can reason using that, and that's going to be a good basis to build upon everything else. And so that's why the scientific method actually kind of has this pluralistic aspect from the very beginning.
Yeah.
We need lots of people to do the observation and come to the same conclusions, and then we have some surety. So people resist it, though, for that one reason. Observation is tainted, we could say. And then for another reason, they don't like the human-centric basis itself of reasoning. And this is really deep. This is a question about finding truth and what the sources of truth is. Because, the whole modern movement in general had human thought, as the basis for this truth. Before that, the basis for truth was something more like the church or revelation from God or something, I'd say, less tangible, is certainly one way of putting it. And then after that, the postmodern period, the pre-modern, modern, postmodern, we pretty much view things with general skepticism. We actually view ourselves skeptically. We're like, don't know if we're good reasoning, don't know if science can really come to. And I'd say a big reason for that is the world wars showed us that men can err.
There's a
once
problem
more.
with man's reasoning. Because think about it. Everything about, and this is a controversial statement, but from a certain perspective, everything that spurred on the great carnage of the 20th century was founded on very reasonable men's thoughts.
Yeah.
Very reasonable considerations. And this is where Heraclitus could speak into this, because he says, if you don't listen to me, and this is a very humble statement from a very wise, aged philosopher who has great process of thought, but he says, listen to the logos. So Heraclitus might say, I know nothing to venture to speak for him, but he might say, this Descartes process of thought could possibly just be people listening to themselves, their interpretation of the facts, their combination of the facts in different orders, in relation to different cultural milieu, what have you. There's one quote that talks about the great flux of being, where he says, one never can step into the same river twice. In those waters, there are always others and others and others. And that's just a powerful poetic statement, and that's all they had at some point. Poetic thought to think about these things. But when you compare it to the quandary of human thought today, it seems to really fit. I have one last question for you, I think. I may have more, but
I'd like
as far as the...
This is enjoyable. I'd like to go as long as possible.
Absolutely. We have a lot to talk about here. The great questions seem to have no bottom. What do you think the great question is that proceeds out of this milieu, the contrast between Heraclitus and Descartes?
It has to be the question of epistemology. From whence do we draw truth? Is there an underlying structure, a metaphysical thing that we can discover sort of deductively and thereby know truth from? Or should we inductively reason our way as a basis for truth?
Maybe there's a third part of that. Are the deductive and inductive faculties also problematic? Both of them.
I think so. In short order, yes.
Can you deductively do it? Can you inductively do it? Or can we just not do it? Are we basically screwed?
Well, that is the problem with epistemology in general. Where do we find truth? What's our source for truth? To be maybe critical about this, I think the postmodernists maybe have this bit right. Being skeptical about all sources of truth is probably the best move. This is not...
It's safe. It's very safe. And, it has some real humility in it, in that, just like we said, and anybody who's read a history book knows, if you just assume that your cultural belief is correct, that your cultural interpretation of Christianity or any religion is correct, and then attempt to impute that upon everyone else, that could really be a tough direction to go down. And what's interesting is, ultimately, there's a problem with that. You have a a situation where people are reasoning in different directions on every way. And then you consider, can we have a unified society or unified cultures?
Yeah.
Think about it. We're living in a melting pot world. Everybody has a cultural milieu. And the only thing that seems to bring them together is economic prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
When that economic prosperity is removed, there doesn't seem to be a binding factor. There could be binding factors, force of government, perhaps totalitarian might.
What about just family?
Together.
I mean, we're not just individuals.
But one family can't necessarily build a society, can it?
I would say that in a sense, tribalism is, an extension of family.
And then at that point, you're Abraham pitching your tent, and then Lot pitches his tents somewhere else. And I apologize for the religious reference, but that's the culture in which I was raised, and that's all I have to draw upon, so you can understand that. But the thing that I would point out from that is a tribal society doesn't seem to be a strong basis for any sort of powerful humanity.
But does the society within which we live, is that a strong basis for powerful humanity?
I'm asserting that as long as economic benefits continue, it will be. But when those are removed, I'm asserting that it seems difficult to see how the society's framework will continue, because like we've noted, people today all seem to be skeptics.
Yes.
They're all reasoning in different directions.
Yeah, generally, yes, skepticism prevails due to the postmodern philosophy in general.
So that then brings up Heraclitus' questions even more. What if everyone was listening to this idea of the logos? Not necessarily a deified essence, but something that was a structure in everything. If that happened, could there be a unification? I don't see a tribal society sending people to Mars.
Yeah. So let's plumb this a bit more. If Heraclitus claimed, or since Heraclitus claimed that logos is endowed upon all men, something like that, then we should be able to look inside of ourselves and somehow discern it. Does that follow?
That does follow. The problem with that is what you've already noted about Descartes.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we've not looked deep enough.
So what would it look like to look? Like, see what I'm getting at? I'm trying to say,
no.
I see what you're saying about what if everyone recognized this internal logos, would we still have, is what you're saying is, would we still have people groups? What exactly are you getting at?
Well, any sort of unified society where people hold values in common.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some values? Prosperity, equally shared, equality of opportunity, a fair shake at the matter.
Yeah.
Just the basic common things that people expect that are not necessarily thought about. People just come to expect them.
Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, those sorts of things.
If you want to get super America-centric, even though we really believe those are values that are universal, and I would be one who
fairly universal,
Yeah, people love life, they love freedom, and they love pursuing happiness.
Sure.
Those are some of the things we do. I would agree with that. But that's the problem, though. Everybody does that a different way. So there has to be something at the same time, it's in the minutia where those things are defined. And not only that, but everyone thinks about them in the same way. But it's impossible to enforce that. The education system was supposedly supposed to do this, to help people find this logos. But now, here's what it is. As a teacher, I can speak to it. Getting good SAT grades. Why? So you can get to college. Why get into college? So you can get a good job. Why get a good job? To make money.
Was that not prosperity?
That's the thing, though. What if all of that dries up? Then there's nothing left.
I see.
There isn't an economic well to go to.
See, this is interesting because modernists had the myth of utopia. And their claim, their drive, which really invented this whole system that you're talking about here, this education, job, wealth building, prosperity thing. This myth of utopia, I mean, I think the postmoderns would certainly claim it's been disproven. That's why we call it a myth.
Sure.
But effectively, if we had the myth of utopia, then what you're saying wouldn't work. We would be able to kind of infinitely grow into prosperity, and it would never dry up. So,
and so far it hasn't from a certain perspective, but with recent events, that have happened for probably the past 20 years, it just continually makes me believe, at least, that the foundation of much of Western thought is very shaky. And we might not have found a sufficient logos. It could be an anti-logos.
I see. So what you're arguing for is that our principles, perhaps American-centric or otherwise, are insufficient.
They don't plumb sufficiently. I mean, they hit on some really good truths, but that's the problem. Heraclitus, when he speaks, seems to talk about some of the deepest stuff at the bottom of being, but I've talked a lot. How do you think Descartes would respond to some of these problems if he were alive today? And I know we hate to speak for these super intelligent people, but what would Descartes say if he saw these very real questions?
To be fair, I really don't. These questions weren't around when Descartes was around. It's kind of what I want to say. Since he was the father of science in a way, this scientific method seemed very promising, seems even today very promising as a method for discovering truth. And it's practical. It's revealed a lot of extremely useful things. We could claim that theoretical physics has more or less produced technology and our understanding of biology, two wonderful fields that would not be around without theoretical physics, which would not be around without the scientific method. We did experiments to discover things about the fundamentals of the world. Chemistry is probably what I meant to say. I said biology, but they're both relevant.
Biology is also very important. I mean,
so, anyways, the questions just wouldn't be there. For him, his answer would probably have to be the same because he's looking at science as, here's our answer. I think, therefore I am. So let's base, and he claims that this was a self-evident, undeniable truth, just so obvious. You would be a fool to deny it because we can't really know that anything exists, but when we think, it would be absurd to say, I think, therefore I'm not. Like, we can't say that because it's breaking the first rule of logic. Something cannot both be and not be.
Absolutely.
And so what we have is, well, I've found a way to apply the first rule of logic into something real, myself. Okay, this is useful. And so now, based on this, let's see if we can grow a philosophy from there from which we can actually make useful observations about the world. And this is science. So I think his answer, even though it's a bit of exactly what he said, it's not really adding anything to the conversation, I guess I would say, would just be science. And he wouldn't have the perspective necessarily that we have to be critical of science at all.
So then, granted then, we probably both agree that Descartes' first principle, I think, therefore I am, the first logical statement in his process of thought is correct. We probably agree there. So then the question that follows from that, everybody has either tacitly or verbally assented to that.
Mm-hmm.
So then where does the human process of thought, in the epistemological sense, go wrong, from your perspective, instead of Descartes' perspective?
Well, that's tricky because, in a way, it doesn't go wrong. In a way, we can use it as a truth-seeking sense, as a truth-seeking faculty. In another way, it fails to reach out far enough. And I think that's maybe where I would say it is a partial epistemological answer and not a total epistemological answer. And importantly, I'm skeptical of its extent. I think that we are rapidly approaching its extent, in fact. So in computer science, there's a problem. Does P equal NP? Almost everyone says no. And then Donald Knuth says, we can't answer that question. I'm with Donald Knuth. I think that we can't answer that question. That's one example. Another one, the theory of everything. There have been two very recent, very promising, I'd say, efforts towards this. Eric Weinstein and Wolfram. Both released separate, very interesting theoretical physics work towards a deeper understanding of physics. However, ultimately, even if they both go to their furthest conclusions, we're going to be sitting here understanding it and saying, well, but what about this? Well, that doesn't go deep enough. Well, from whence does those things come from? Our answers that we're looking for, the truth that we're seeking, won't be answered, is my view, by I think, therefore I am.
Now, there's two questions there. One of them is kind of in the minutia. Those of you who don't know, Jacob comes from the strong scientist, engineering background. I come from the more poetic, artistic. I went to an art school background. He went to a science school. I went to an art school. So we have a very interesting dichotomy here. Layman question, the theory of everything. When I hear that, I think of the movie Theory of Everything with Eddie Redmayne, the actor, and he played a scientist from Britain. Stephen Hawking came up with something called the theory of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Why do people consider a theory of everything?
What do people think about it in the first place?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's good. If we want to get really philosophical here, I think our answer would have to be Heraclitus' answer, which is all men are endowed with logos. And it's this logos, which we kind of translated structure previously, which tells us, let's structure things. Let's do science. Let's make categories. And when we start thinking, we're like, well, what does everything work out of? What is chemistry? What is physics? What is quantum physics? To speak of small physics. When it comes down to it, there's dual motivation. I think that all good physicists are such because they really internally wonder about the world. The second motivation is because physics allows us prosperity. It allows us real, tangible progress in order to create new things like I referenced earlier.
And that leads me to probably my most prominent difficulty with this science equaling logos. Science could be a creation of categories. That's one way we can maybe define it. It's observation, it's forming hypotheses and testing those hypotheses. Sure. But another way to say it is simply forming categories.
Okay.
But what I heard in what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the process of forming categories leads to logos. So it can't both be logos to form categories and lead towards logos. So I see an incongruity there that perhaps might just be my own inability to interpret what you're saying. And a question to consider there is, logos, spoken of by Heraclitus, seems to be a limitless thing.
Yeah.
Not a minutia. You can make many categories. That's another debate for another time.
Sure.
Will the categories ever run out?
Well, theoretically, no, but how many are useful? How many are fundamental? That's another question.
That's the thing that's tough for me.
So I guess maybe what you heard is not incorrect, what you heard me say, but I would clarify. It could both stem from and be creating in this sense. If you have a blank bookshelf and that bookshelf implies a library, but there aren't any books there. Okay, so the bookshelf is logos. It's a library. But yet it's not a library because there's no books there.
We can't seem to study it, to grasp it.
So what we do is we fill it with books and it becomes a library.
But is that merely us deciding that what we have found is that library called logos? Or is it that we have gone out to the forest, chopped down a tree, treated the wood, built ourselves a bookshelf, drew a title on it in crayon, called logos, and then put books on it, and that's a very terrible view of modern science.
What a wonderful metaphor.
So that's probably my big problem, is I have trouble seeing how the scientific method and I love what it has given us. I agree with you. It's given us prosperity. It's given us so many things, but I don't believe it's hit rock bottom of the ocean yet, and that might be
yeah.
why we're considering the theory of everything so much.
I mean, you and I agree on that. I said previously, I think, therefore I am is a sufficient epistemological basis to find the truth that we're looking for. It can find a lot of truth, but not all truth.
Could someone write a sentence, formulate a sentence in the same way as Descartes, that would be a more effective basis for a new method for finding logos? Could that ever happen, or do you think that Descartes plumbed it as deeply as he could? And in all honesty, folks, that might be the question that we are considering here throughout our narrative.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think Descartes did not plumb it as deeply as he could. In his own framework, he admitted this is a very simple basis. He admitted this is not that wonderful, but he also said, this is all I could find. I searched for years and years and years, and finally this came to me, and this is it. This is all I could find. So, I don't know how to answer your question. It could be that human reasoning is all that we have to go off of epistemologically. However, I think the postmoderns are right in that even human reasoning has its flaws. Even human reasoning is worthy of receiving skepticism. So, yes, we'd like to find a different basis. Do I know what it is? No. Can anyone ever find a better sentence? I don't know.
I'd like to be an optimist and say that yes, I really would like to say that we could find something better that would better the human race even more. And folks, those are some of the great questions that we've been considering, the people the world over have been considering since time immemorial. And part of the human experience is considering these questions, and we hope here at the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast that you will consider those questions with us. This has been Jacob Murdoch and Brandon Moore, signing off.